Hi students, Ms. Gardner here to take you through a lesson on Introduction to Chemical Nomenclature. So nomenclature is just the practice of how we chemists name chemical compounds. So as you've probably noticed before, if you looked on the back of a food label, you saw a big long list of ingredients, and some of the names were complicated and really hard to pronounce. Well, by the time that we finish up with this unit, you will have no problem reading them, and you will also be able to even identify what type of compound those are. So let's go ahead and get started and learn about the rules. Make sure you've got your notebook ready and you have space to take notes. So before we can name a compound, we have to figure out if it is an ionic compound or a covalent compound. It's easy to distinguish these. You really just have to ask yourself one thing. Is there a metal? So in a covalent compound, that is a compound that is made up of only nonmetals. So things like CCl4, N2O5, PF3, those are all covalent compounds. I don't see a metal in sight. An ionic compound, on the other hand, they're compounds made up of a metal and a nonmetal. So that could be like Al2O3. I see aluminum there, that's a metal. NaCl, I see sodium, that's a metal. Or CaCl2, calcium, that's a metal. And notice the metals are always written first. That's an important part of writing chemical formulas and naming them. The metal always goes first. Okay, so let's look at some names of covalent compounds and see if we can find any patterns. So here we have NF3, that's called nitrogen trifluoride. We have NO, nitrogen monoxide, NO2, nitrogen dioxide, and N2O4 is dinitrogen tetroxide. Do you notice any patterns here? So hopefully you saw that sometimes we put a prefix in front of the element to indicate how many of them there are. So for instance, I see tri in front of fluoride, that tells me there's 3 fluorides. I see mono in front of oxide, that tells me 1 oxygen. But notice I don't have mono in front of nitrogen. Okay, that's weird. NO2, nitrogen dioxide, di here tells me 2 oxygens. Dinitrogen tetroxide, di meaning 2 nitrogens, tetra being the prefix for 4. Okay, so let's break down these rules. Make sure you are writing down these rules here. So covalent compound naming rules. So first, you name your first element. You just name it exactly as it is on the periodic table. You don't change the ending or anything. Now you're going to name the second element. The second element always has its ending changed to IDE. So bromine becomes bromide, fluorine becomes fluoride, what else do we have? Sulfur becomes sulfide, phosphorus becomes phosphide. All right, if some of those you can't really figure out what that might sound like, you can look that up online, and it's pretty easy to see how they'll sound. Okay, so we have our first element named just regular. Our second element has its ending changed to IDE. Now we need to add prefixes. So pre here, that means it comes before. So these prefixes are small segments of words that we're going to add before some of the element names to indicate how many of each element there are in a compound. Now, there's a weird exception. The prefix mono is never used for the first element. And I can't really give you a great reason why. Chemistry is full of rules that have been around for hundreds of years, and this is just how some of these things are. But the way I remember it is you might be familiar with the molecule carbon monoxide, right? Carbon monoxide poisoning is something that can happen if you leave a generator running inside. So carbon monoxide, that's a covalent compound. Notice the carbon comes first, and there's no prefix in front of it, but I just have one of them. And then monoxide means 1 oxygen. So the chemical formula for carbon monoxide is CO. Okay, so let's look at what the prefixes are. And many of these I'm sure you can probably guess. So mono stands for 1, di for 2, tri for 3, tetra 4, penta 5. So you've probably heard of the Pentagon. That building has 5 signs. hexa 6, hepta 7, octa 8, nona 9, and deca is 10. So maybe from physics you remember a decameter was 10 times as large as a meter. Or in the Olympics, you can run a decathlon, and that is 10 different events. All right, so make sure you have each of these written down. Now let's use these to do some practice. Okay, so first one, NO2. All right, so we're going to name our first element, nitrogen. We're going to name our second, oxygen, change that ending to IDE, so oxide. Now we add prefixes. We have just one nitrogen, but do we put mono on the first element? No. So it's just going to be nitrogen. Then I have 2 oxygens. It will be nitrogen dioxide. All right, take a moment and try the next one, CCl4. Did you say carbon tetrachloride? Make sure you didn't say monocarbon tetrachloride. Remember, no mono on the first element. All right, S2Cl2. All right, I've got 2 of each, so I need the prefix di for each of them. Disulfur, dichloride. 2 sulfurs, 2 chlorides. Now this last one here, you'll notice I changed the font because I want to make sure you know that that's a capital I and not an L. So capital I, Br. So iodine, bromide. I just have one bromine, so it needs to be iodine monobromide. All right, notice there's no mono in front of the iodine. All right, let's look at ionic compounds. So here are some ionic compounds and their names. I have KCl, potassium chloride, CaO, calcium oxide, AlCl3, aluminum chloride, Li3N, lithium nitride, Sr3P2, strontium phosphide. Do you see any similarities to covalent naming? Hopefully you saw that all the endings of these second elements are also IDE. So anytime we have an IDE, that indicates something is in a compound. Now, what about some differences? Do you see any prefixes here? No. We have no prefixes with ionic compounds, and that actually makes that a little bit easier to name them. So here are our rules for ionic compound basic naming. So first, we're going to write our metal first. The metal always goes first in the formula and when I write it. The metal is also sometimes called the cation, and we'll talk about that later this year. So we write our metal first, just as it is on the periodic table. We're going to write this non-metal next. That's also referred to as the anion, and we're going to change the ending to IDE. All right, so far, we're just like covalent. Now, here's where we stop. We don't need any prefixes. It doesn't matter if I have 3 lithiums or 2 fluorines. I don't need to put any prefixes. And why? Well, that's because of how ionic compounds come together. They're always going to be in the same ratios. So we actually don't need to indicate how many we have of each, but we have to do that for covalent. So I'm going to shout this. Compounds with metals never get prefixes. Repeat that back to yourself. Do compounds with metals ever get prefixes? No, definitely not. So I better not see any trisodiums or dimagnesium. No, no, no. Okay, let's do some practice. AlF3. All right, so I'm going to name my first metal, aluminum, and then my second element, fluorine, just turns into fluoride. Do I need prefixes? No. Aluminum fluoride. That's it. All right, NaCl. You might be familiar with this one, and you might use it at home to season your popcorn. I have Na, sodium, Cl, chlorine. That changes to chloride, sodium chloride. All right, MgBr2, magnesium bromide. All right, so ionic is pretty easy. The only trick that students get caught on is like sometimes they'll start putting prefixes in their ionic compounds. So just ask yourself, is there a metal? If there's a metal, no prefixes. Okay, all right, rewatch this, make sure you've got your notes, and we'll talk more in class.